They never expected to find anything beneath the pulpit. Not in a place like Milfield, Ohio, a town so small that by the time the war between the states began, it had already started to vanish from memory. A town where the church stood. Like a hollow rib cage in the middle of a dying forest, its stained glass eyes dimmed by decades of grime and silence. Its pews lined with dust and forgotten prayers, and in the spring of 1847, when a crew of laborers was sent to tear it down and salvage the timber, they thought it would be another day's work, a few nails, a few broken boards, maybe a dead raccoon beneath the altar. But what they found was something else, entirely something hidden, something intentional beneath the ornately carved pulpit. There was a hollow in the stone floor, not obvious, not even accessible without shifting the entire weight of the structure, and embedded in the hollow was a panel of oak so finely joined that it vanished into the grainwork invisible, until the angle of the morning light caught its edge just right, and then there it was, a seam, where there should have been none, a line in the wood that spoke of design, not decay. And when Joseph Harkins the carpenter lowered himself to examine it, his fingers trembled before he touched it. He would later say that he felt something radiating from that panel, not heat, not cold, something like gravity, but stronger, as if whatever was inside was pulling at the bones beneath his skin. And when he pressed against the grain, the panel gave way with a click, not like wood, snapping more like a mechanism, releasing a breath held too long. And inside the hidden chamber, lined in lead and wrapped in oilskin, was a single object, a leather-bound journal. Cracked with age but unbroken, its clasp still fastened, its corners scuffed but intact, and beside it, wrapped in faded linen, were 15 folded maps, each drawn by hand, each marked in red ink with the same phrase again and again, the promised land. And when Harkins opened the journal, his hands shook so violently he could barely hold it open, because inside were names, rows upon rows of names, over 8,000 names, each written in the same precise handwriting, each with a date, a place, a vie, cause of death, and next to each name in the same dark ink, a figure, a monetary value, a calculation of assets, land holdings, tools, livestock, sometimes even children noted as dependents with estimates beside them. And it was clear to anyone with eyes that this was no ordinary record. It was a ledger, a death ledger, a cold and deliberate accounting of lives, not as souls, but as commodities. And Harkins did not speak for several minutes. He only stared, and then slowly closed the book and wrapped it again, and told the others to leave it be. He later testified that it was not fear that silenced him, but recognition. Something in the handwriting, something in the structure of the book, reminded him of ledgers he had seen as a boy growing up in Cincinnati, in the offices of men who traded in land and lumber, and occasionally other things not listed on paper. And so he took the book and the maps and turned them over to the authorities. And that night he did not sleep, not for a moment. Not even when the candle burned low and the house grew cold. He would later tell his wife that he felt as though something had followed him home, not a spirit, not a curse, something heavier, like the weight of unseen eyes watching from just beyond the edge of thought. And the next morning the sheriff arrived, William Blackwood, a man known for his stubbornness and sense of order, a man who had never once failed to lock his doors or document his evidence. And he took the book and the maps and placed them in the iron cabinet in his office, and turned the key and put the key in his vest pocket, and locked the vest in a drawer, and locked the drawer in a room that he also locked behind him. And by the time the sun rose the next day, the cabinet was empty, the journal and the maps gone, as if they had never existed. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbed furniture. And the sheriff was found dead 3 days later, sitting in his chair, his eyes open, his mouth twisted, as if he had died mid-scream, the official cause listed as heart failure. But those who saw the body said his skin was pale with strange blotches beneath the surface, and that his expression did not fade even in death. And his deputy, Thomas Reed, left the county within the week, resigned his post, sold his belongings, and boarded a coach bound west, and was never heard from again. Though a letter surfaced years later, written in a trembling hand and sent to a cousin in Illinois, in which Reed wrote that what he saw in that room that morning was not meant for any man to see, and that God himself would weep to know what had been done in his name. And from that day forward, no one spoke of the journal again, not officially, not publicly, but in the back. Ruins of taverns and in the whispered warnings of old farmers, the story lingered, a story of a preacher and his brothers, and the lands they called holy, a story of entire families who disappeared into the soil of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, leaving behind only graves and silence and the phrase "the promised land" etched into the corners of maps like a curse. And as the years passed, and the church collapsed, and the town dwindled, those who remembered kept quiet, not from guilt, not even from fear, but from a deeper instinct, something primal that told them that some truths are not meant to be unearthed, that some histories rot for a reason, and that to dig too deeply into the past is to awaken something that has only been sleeping, waiting, watching. And when the journal vanished, so did any chance of a formal reckoning the pages that could have proved everything, the maps that showed the pattern, the handwriting that matched other documents known, but never connected, all gone, all erased, as if the land itself had swallowed them whole. And yet the names remained burned into memory, passed down, like poison in bloodlines, names that still echo in the soil, names that the earth has not forgotten, names that do not fade because they were never meant to be forgiven. And though the church is gone and the records lost, there are still nights in Milfield when the wind carries strange sounds, when the ground feels too soft beneath your feet, and when the silence inside the bones of the town grows too loud to bear. And on those nights, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The scratch of pen on paper, the sound of a ledger being updated. Another soul, another calculation. And though the church has been gone for more than a century, some say the pulpit was never truly removed, only buried, only hidden, and that beneath the weeds and the broken stones, something still waits. A compartment sealed with lead and fear, and names that cry out not for justice, but for release. And what frightens people most is not what was written in that journal, but what was not: the empty pages, the blank spaces, the room left for more entries. Because someone had expected the list to grow, someone had planned for it, someone had looked at death not as tragedy, but as opportunity. And the maps, the ones marked with disease patterns and flood zones and economic forecasts, they were not warnings. They were strategies, and the towns marked in red were not mistakes, they were harvests. And when you understand that, when you truly let that truth settle in your gut, it changes something in you. It bends your sense of reality until you can no longer pretend that history is clean or that faith is always light. And in that moment, when the weight of it all presses down and you feel your breath shorten and your pulse quicken, you are finally seeing the world as they saw it, not as a place of saints and sinners, but as a field of numbers and names and prices and graves. And in that realization, you become part of the story, part of the silence that follows, and you begin to understand why the journal had to vanish, not to hide the past, but to protect the future, to keep others from seeing the pattern, from recognizing the design, from connecting the dots that form a map not just of land, but of something darker, something ancient, something that never needed a name. Only obedience, only blood, only belief. And once you see it, once you hear it, once you feel it, there is no turning back, because now you know what they knew, and you will carry it too, the weight, the names, the silence. And no matter how far you run or how deep you bury it, it will find you in the end, because the ledger is still open and the promised land is still waiting. 3 days after Sheriff William Blackwood took possession of the journal and maps, he was found slumped in his chair in the corner of his study, his eyes wide open and fixed on a point just above the doorway, as if something had entered the room. and stood there silently waiting for him to die. His mouth was drawn in a crooked shape, neither scream nor whisper, just a distortion of bone and flesh, like something had tried to pull the breath from his throat and left his face twisted in protest. The coroner, a traveling doctor from Lancaster, listed heart failure, but made no note of the gray hue beneath the skin or the strange pattern of lines that curled up from Blackwood's wrists to his elbows, faint and thin, like burn marks or old veins traced with ink. And when Deputy Thomas Reed entered the study that morning, he stood still for nearly 10 minutes before he could move his legs, and when he finally stepped forward and saw that the iron cabinet had been opened without sign of force and the journal and maps were gone, he turned around and walked out without saying a word, and by nightfall he had packed what little he owned and left town, and no one ever saw him again. His resignation was found on the sheriff's desk, a single line written in haste. I will not speak of what I have seen. Do not ask me. And no one did, because whatever had passed through that office had left more than a dead man and an empty cabinet. It had left a warning, and that warning spread like smoke through the county, drifting into homes and taverns and parlor rooms until every man and woman with memory of the Westbrook name felt their stomach tighten when the wind changed direction, and in the weeks that followed something else began to unravel, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, like the unraveling of a thread sewn into the hem of something older and more important than anyone wanted to admit. The Milfield church, which had stood abandoned for over 20 years, was visited one night by a man in a dark coat who came by horseback and left no name. The caretaker, who lived near the edge of town, saw him enter with nothing and leave with a wrapped bundle tucked beneath his arm. He moved quickly without pause and never looked back. The caretaker said his horse was strange too. It didn't make a sound, no snort, no shuffle, just stood there like it was listening. And the next day, the last of the church walls collapsed as if released from a duty it had been bound to for decades, and beneath the rubble, where the pulpit once stood, the ground was found scorched, the wood blackened in a way that did not match decay or fire, but something else, something that burned without flame and left no scent. And in the years that followed, the land remained untouched. Every attempt to build there failed. Every structure sank or cracked or shifted as if the soil itself was rejecting foundations, and beneath the weeds and broken glass, children began to say they heard singing on quiet nights, soft and low like morning hymns sung through water, and some said they saw shapes moving through the trees, not spirits, not shadows, but figures dressed in black, walking slowly along invisible paths, maps without paper, destinations without names, and always heading east toward the river. And by 1850, the town of Milfield had withered into a skeleton of its former self. Buildings emptied, roads overgrown, and no one spoke of the journal or the sheriff man in the coat, because by then the pattern had begun to emerge, not in books, not in newsprint, but in death, sudden and quiet, and always accompanied by silence. Entire families lost to fever in towns with names too similar to ignore. Logan, Danville, Marion, Clarksville, each one a place where a church had been built and abandoned, each one near land that had once been flooded, once been swamp, once been known for sickness and death. And the names of the dead began to echo those listed in the journal, or so claimed the few who remembered the entries and had dared to say them aloud. And in those years after Blackwood's death, the story transformed. It stopped being a rumor and became something heavier, something more dangerous, because now it was not about a single town or a failed church. It was about a design, something planned, something repeated, a system, not a mistake. And the question no one wanted to ask, but everyone began to feel in their bones, was who took the journal, and why did they want it not to destroy it? That was certain, because if they had wanted it gone, it would have been burned or buried or left to rot. Instead, it had been taken with care, with speed, and with purpose. And there were whispers that it had not gone far, that somewhere just beyond the edge of the county line in a farmhouse, or a cellar, or beneath the floorboards of another forgotten church, it waited. And what disturbed those who remembered most was not just the loss of evidence, but the loss of the maps. Those 15 hand-drawn sheets marked with disease patterns and land plots and future settlement sites. Those maps were the real key, because they showed where the next promised lands would be. And if the maps were gone, then someone knew the plan, someone held the template for death and profit and silence, and could repeat it with impunity. And in the decades that followed, outbreaks of fever and collapse were recorded in towns that had never existed on early government maps. Towns founded by traveling preachers who spoke of divine calling, towns built quickly and emptied even quicker. And in each case, records were lost cemeteries, left unmarked, and land quickly reclaimed by buyers, with no known names, often through legal proxies that traced back to nowhere, and all of it followed the same curve. The same signature of strategy, masked as salvation. And those who tried to investigate found their work interrupted by sickness or misfortune or disappearance, until the pattern itself became a curse. Those who saw too much died. Those who dug too deep vanished. And when the old caretaker of the Milfield church was found dead in 1862, his body frozen beside his well eyes, open hands still clutching the rusted padlock. He had once used to seal the church gates. There were no questions asked, no autopsy performed, just a burial and a prayer, and a silence that swallowed his name. And yet not everything vanished, not completely, because in 1883, a boy digging near the edge of the ruined church found a single page half buried in the mud, wrapped in oilskin and marked with that same steady handwriting. It was a ledger. Entry dated July 1812. The name listed was Jonathan Crane. Cause of death, swamp fever. Assessed value 4 oxen, 1 acre, 2 daughters. Age noted 9 and 11, marked as dependents. Future yield uncertain. And at the bottom of the page, written in red ink, a phrase not found elsewhere in the recovered records, noted not in settlement, designated for future promise. And that one line changed everything, because it meant that not every death was a mistake. Some were deferred, some were investments, some were recorded years before they occurred. And that meant the ledger was not just a record, it was a forecast, a prophecy written in the language of numbers and blood. And that meant the pattern was older, deeper, more ingrained than anyone had imagined. And if there were pages still missing and maps still held, then the conspiracy had never ended. It had only changed its skin, and those who carried it forward were not ghosts or legends. They were men with land titles and deeds and sermons written in ink that had not yet dried. And that was the horror that followed the disappearance of the journal. Not the loss of evidence, but the confirmation that it was never meant to be hidden, only passed from hand to hand like a sacred text, a blueprint for wealth built on graves and suffering. And all that remained was to wonder how many more towns were marked, how many more names had already been written, and how many more were still to come, because the silence that followed was not the end. It was only the next chapter waiting to be opened, waiting to be spoken, waiting for someone foolish or desperate enough to read aloud what was never meant to be heard. The early years of the 19th century in America were marked by a fever, not of the body, but of the soul, a convulsion of spirit that swept across the land like wildfire. Through dry grass they called it the Second Great Awakening. But for those who lived through it, it felt more like a reckoning than a revival. Tent meetings rose in the fields. Like sudden storms, voices cried out into the night sky, trembling with visions and prophecy, and men who had never held a Bible found themselves speaking in tongues. Women fainted under the weight of unseen hands. Children wept and sang and screamed in equal measure. It was not order, it was not peace. It was a hunger, a tearing at the veil between the seen and the unseen, and Ohio the young frontier state, barely 3 years into its statehood, became the crucible of this spiritual explosion, because it was new, because it was lawless, because it was empty. Enough for old gods to die and new ones to be born. The old churches of the East had grown stiff with ritual, bloated with politics, their doors polished and their sermons cold. But on the frontier, where the forest still whispered and the rivers had not yet been named, faith became wild again. It unshackled itself from pews and robes and liturgies and became something untamed, a voice in the dark, a fire in the chest, a sickness of the spirit that no medicine could cure. And into this boiling chaos came men like Isaiah Westbrook, men with charm and poise and the terrifying ability to make others believe not just in God, but in them, men who could stare into the eyes of strangers and convince them that their pain had meaning, that their suffering was holy, that the soil beneath their feet was sacred, not because it was good, but because it was hard, because it resisted, because it broke the weak and purified the strong. And what no one understood at the time, what no one could have known until it was too late, was that this madness, this shaking of faith and reason, was the perfect soil for something older and colder and more deliberate to take root, because while the people wailed and danced and fell to their knees while they chased visions and miracles and spoke of heaven touching earth, there were others who watched, who listened, who took notes and mapped patterns and calculated the yield of human devotion against the limits of human endurance. And they asked questions not of the divine, but of logistics. How much land could be bought for the price of salvation? How many families could be moved with a single sermon? How much suffering would be tolerated if framed as sanctification? And above all, how long could the cycle repeat before anyone noticed, before anyone understood that the same fever that brought revival also brought death, and that the line between a prophet and a predator was as thin as the paper on which their scriptures were written? And so the awakening continued, town after town, field after field, voices rising in the night, pleading for grace, or perhaps just for meaning, and behind it all, a quiet rhythm of structure, a set of invisible hands guiding the fervor, shaping it into something profitable, something sustainable, something deadly. And those who looked too closely were dismissed as skeptics, or worse, as tools of the devil, because in the language of the awakening, to doubt was sin and to question was heresy. And so the machinery kept turning. Preachers became landlords, sermons became contracts, and the line between faith and finance vanished like mist in the morning sun. And by the time people began to whisper about sickness, about disappearances, about strange men in black riding from one town to the next, it was already too late. The awakening had done its work. It had built the scaffolding for the promised lands to rise and fall and rise again, each one more calculated, more refined, more lethal than the last. And the horror of it all was not that men died or that children were buried in unmarked graves. The horror was that it worked, that the system functioned flawlessly, that every death increased the value of the land, and every loss of faith could be spun into a deeper calling. And the only thing required to maintain the illusion was silence and a few willing martyrs. And as the fever spread, and Ohio, filled with desperate settlers looking for both purpose and property, the Westbrooks and those like them saw opportunity not for salvation, but for ownership, because God may have made the land, but men decided who profited from it. And with enough conviction and enough bodies, even the most cursed soil could be sold as sacred. And the deeper tragedy was that the people who came believed with everything they had. They believed the pain meant progress, the loss meant purification. They believed their children died for a higher purpose, and that their hunger was a test of spirit, not the result of a lie. And they died believing it. They died grateful, even joyful, some of them, convinced they had been chosen. And that belief, that absolute trust, was what made the promised land so lucrative, because it meant there would always be another wave of settlers, another crop of believers, another harvest. And it meant that when the bodies began to fall, the survivors would not ask why. They would ask how to endure. They would stay. They would. Pray they would kneel in the blood-soaked soil and thank God for the suffering, and when they could endure no more and fled the land in shame, the land would be waiting clean and cheap and empty, ready for the next revelation, the next vision, next settlement, and behind every sermon, behind every revival, behind every great spiritual outpouring was a ledger, a map, a plan drawn not in ink but in infection, marked not by angels but by the measured decay of the human body in hostile terrain. And what no one dared to say aloud was that perhaps the fever had not come from God at all. Perhaps it had come from men who understood that belief was the most powerful currency in the world, and that when properly invested it could yield returns far beyond land or gold. It could yield obedience, silence, death, and the resurrection of a lie that no one dared to challenge because it felt so holy. And that was the truth that made the Second Great Awakening not just a religious movement, but a crime scene, a field of unmarked graves scattered across 3 states, hidden beneath steeples and revival tents and the bones of churches built to fall. And when the fever finally broke and the meetings faded and the fire burned low, the land remained, the graves remained, the maps remained somewhere tucked in closets and beneath floorboards and in the hands of men who never preached but always profited. And the awakening was over, but the pattern endured, and the land still waited, and the next generation still listened for voices and dreamed of holiness and packed their wagons for the frontier. And the whisper that followed them was not from heaven but from ledgers still being written, and names still being added, and the promise still unbroken that, with enough faith and enough silence, any soil could become sacred and any death could be made holy if the price was right. In the spring of 1803, when the roads into Ohio were still little more than muddy cuts through forest, and the rivers still ran red with the clay of land not yet claimed by law, a man arrived in Chillicothe with nothing but a cart half covered in burlap, a well-oiled Bible, and a voice that seemed too large for his frame. His name was Isaiah Westbrook, and though the records would list him as a preacher, a merchant, a settler, and at times a prophet, the truth was more difficult, more dangerous, more precise, because what Isaiah brought with him was not faith and not hope, but a system, a blueprint, already tested, already failed once in the East, but now ready to be perfected far from the eyes of creditors, judges, and newspapers. And as he stood in the center of the town square, his beard combed and gleaming in the morning sun, his eyes the color of winter water, his voice began to rise slow, at first steady, measured, like a man giving instruction to those already convinced. And what he preached was not repentance and not fire. It was revelation, personal revelation, direct, unfiltered, unsupervised. It was the kind of doctrine that gave men permission to believe what they needed to believe and to follow not God, but the man who claimed to speak for him. And they followed because he looked like he had seen something, because when he spoke of holy ground, they believed the dirt beneath their boots began to hum, and when he said the old churches have lost their way, that salvation had been buried beneath stone and tradition, they nodded because they too had felt the dead weight of rituals that meant nothing, and prayers that never returned answers. And in Isaiah Westbrook they saw a man who not only knew where God had gone, but how to bring him back. And for the first few months he kept it simple. He walked the roads between towns, he sat in fields and spoke to farmers. He helped mend fences and offered scripture in exchange for bread. And slowly, almost invisibly, the crowds grew, not because he shouted louder, but because he made them feel seen, made them feel chosen, made them believe that their suffering was not just the result of poverty or misfortune, but evidence of a divine calling. And those who were sick grew sicker in faith. Those who had lost everything gave what little remained, because he spoke to the place in them that still remembered Eden and whispered that it could be rebuilt here in Ohio, in the wet, dark soil of the frontier. And those who questioned those who remembered him from Connecticut as a failed merchant, as a man who left in the dead of night. One step ahead of charges filed in Hartford. They were ignored at first, then dismissed and eventually gone. Whether by choice or by pressure, no one could say. And within a year, Isaiah had purchased a small tract of land just north of Chillicothe, a rise of hill bordered by dying trees and soggy fields, and there he built a meeting house, simple at first, then slowly. Adorned each carving on the pulpit, a symbol each nail driven with purpose, and it was there he first spoke the phrase, the new promise, not the old covenant, not the gospel of Jerusalem, but something newer, purer. And he said God had shown him in a vision not a heaven above, but a heaven below, a land, not yet settled, but already blessed, and that those who followed him would not just be believers, but builders of the kingdom itself, and the promise he offered was not of eternal life, but of land. Good land theirs by divine right, and their suffering would not be in vain, because each hardship was proof of their selection, and each death a seed planted in the soil of redemption. And in that message was the trap, because once they believed that, pain was holy then, no amount of it would make them turn back, and what none of them saw was that Isaiah was not alone, that even as he stood in the square and called, men to God, his brothers, were already laying the foundation for something else. Something colder, something with records and maps and ledgers and deeds, and every name he gathered, every soul he stirred, became a number on a page, a calculation, and what he sold them as faith, he measured as value, and behind the pulpit beneath, the boards in a hidden compartment carved by his own hands, he kept the first journal, the one no one saw, the one where he did not write scripture, but names, dates, illnesses, purchases, sales. It was his gospel, but it was written in blood and currency. And for those who gathered to hear him preach, none of it mattered, because when he spoke, they felt something pass through them, something real, something sharp, and for the first time in their lives, they believed they were part of something larger, something divine, and in that belief they gave everything. They gave land and livestock and children. They gave their futures, and when they died, as many soon would their deaths were, not grieved, but recorded, measured, and folded into a greater purpose. And those who survived were told it was a test that the Lord was pruning the vine, that their suffering meant they had been chosen, and in the eyes of the Westbrooks, it was true, not spiritually, not metaphorically, but literally they had been chosen, to die in places that would later be reclaimed and sold and settled again, and again each death, clearing the way for profit, each sermon softening the ground for acquisition. And as the years passed and the legend of Isaiah Westbrook grew, he began to speak less of Jesus and more of vision, less of scripture and more of land. He began to draw maps in the dirt, and spoke of towns not yet built, but already named, and each time he uttered the phrase promised land, his followers heard salvation. But he meant real estate, and the tragedy, the true horror, was that it worked, that no one questioned, that no one noticed the pattern, because they were too blinded by their own longing, too desperate to belong, too terrified to be left behind. And those who left, those who sensed something was wrong, found themselves exiled, shunned, treated as if they had blasphemed against God himself, and they fled not just the church, but the county, and those who remained were bound tighter than blood by guilt, by grief, by hope. And it is said that Isaiah Westbrook once told his inner circle during a private meeting that the difference between a prophet and a tyrant is only a matter of how well the story is told, and he was a storyteller above all else, and each death, each family, each ruined farm was a chapter, and he was writing a gospel in soil and silence and ledger lines. And when he died and his bones returned to the same dirt, he had sold and resold. The pattern did not end, because he had built something bigger than himself, something self-sustaining, something fed not by belief, but by inheritance, by structure, by silence. And so he remains not in memory, not in myth, but in land deeds and forgotten towns, and in the eyes of those who still preach visions in places where the earth remembers too much and refuses to forget, and every time someone stands in a clearing and speaks of holy ground and new beginnings, you must ask yourself what lies beneath the soil, who was buried there first, and what promises were made before you arrived, because the land does not lie, and the ground does not forget, and the voice that calls. You may not be God at all, but only the echo of Isaiah Westbrook still preaching from beneath. The roots still counting, still calculating, still waiting. They called themselves the faithful of the new promise, not because they understood what that meant, but because it made them feel chosen. And when Isaiah Westbrook spoke those words for the first time during a gathering under a collapsing barn roof in the autumn of 1804, the people who knelt before him wet with sweat and trembling from the weight of exhaustion and revelation did not ask questions. They simply repeated it again and again, like a name they had forgotten, like a vow they had always meant to make, because that was the genius of it. It required nothing but suffering and promised everything in return: a pure community, a sacred people, a land untouched by the corruption of the eastern cities, a place where faith would not just be practiced, but lived embedded in the very soil and justified by death. And though none of them had seen what lay ahead, they believed it because belief was the only currency. They had left, and Isaiah knew that, and he fed it to them slowly, deliberately, sermon by sermon, story by story, until their faith was no longer a personal thing, but a public identity, a mark worn like a scar or a seal. And once that happened, there was no turning back, because to doubt Isaiah was to doubt God, and to leave the community was to leave salvation. And so they built it together, one cabin at a time, one fence post at a time, one prayer whispered in the cold. Before sunrise, before the fever set in, before the children stopped speaking, and the graves began to form concentric circles around the church that stood too tall for the valley, too proud for the marsh, too clean for the blood that fed its foundation. And Isaiah called it the temple of the new inheritance, carved it himself into the doorframe above the entrance in letters so deep that when the rains came, they filled with water and looked like dark eyes watching the congregation from above. And when he stood before them, arms wide, beard soaked with dew and scripture bleeding from his throat, they felt not just awe but fear, a righteous terror that made them confess things they had never told. Their own mothers made them offer things they did not know they owned, and he called this surrender purification, called their hunger a fast, called their grief a divine harvest. And in the language of the faithful, there were no victims, only offerings. And when the children began to waste away pale, and shaking their eyes gone glassy, and their words reduced to mutters, and hymns no one questioned, no one fled, not even when the coughing became a chorus, not even when the graveyard doubled in size. Because Isaiah had already told them this would happen, he had prepared them not with facts, but with prophecy. And in prophecy, death is not failure, it is fulfillment. And so they dug, and they sang, and they wept, and they waited for the miracle that would never come, because the miracle was not for them. It was for the land, for the value of it, for the cleansing of it through flesh and tears. And those who remained healthy watched with a strange silence, because some part of them knew, but could not name what they knew, and the mind will bend before it breaks. And so they bent, and when Isaiah told them to rejoice, they did even as they buried their sons, and burned their cradles, and sold their last coins to purchase more seed for soil that would not bear. And that was the theology of the new promise. Not hope, not grace, but transformation through attrition. A sanctification by subtraction. The fewer, the stronger, the dead, the purer, and the land richer for having consumed them. And if this sounds impossible, if it sounds like madness, then you do not understand what longing can do to a person you do not know what it means to see your life fail and hear a man tell you it was God's design, and that the pain you feel is not random but sacred, because when everything has been taken from you, that lie is the only thing that feels like truth and Isaiah. Westbrook was not just a preacher, he was an architect, and the faithful were not just a congregation, they were material. They were raw substance, and he shaped them into something that could endure, not because it was good, but because it was obedient. And the rules were simple: stay, suffer, believe, and above all, never leave. And those who did try, those who slipped into the woods at night, those who tried to return to towns that no longer remembered them, were declared unfaithful, and stories were told about them, stories of madness and sickness and suicide. And whether those stories were true, no one knew, but no one wanted to find out. And so the walls of the community grew higher, though they were invisible, made of shame and fear and theology. And each time a new family arrived, they were welcomed like long-lost kin, like lambs returned to the flock, and they too surrendered. Quickly, because the weight of the promise was seductive, it pressed down on the soul and made you feel necessary, made you feel part of a secret plan. And Isaiah never used the word cult, never called it a movement. He called it preparation. He said the world was sick and God was cleansing it through them. And each death, each fever, each empty cradle was proof that the process was working, and the faithful wrote it down, carved it into stone, stitched it into blankets, passed it down in lullabies, so that even the children, who would not live long enough to learn Scripture, would still know the rhythm of obedience and the language of holy hunger. And when strangers passed through, they were watched, politely spoken to, briefly warned gently. And if they asked too many questions, they were told to leave. And if they did not, they were made to. And their names did not appear in the church ledger, but sometimes you could find them scratched into the underside of floorboards, or whispered into the fire, when the winds howled and the faithful huddled together, singing not for warmth, but for silence, because they understood now that the promise was not about joy or peace. It was about control. It was about keeping the structure intact and the illusion alive. And so the rituals became stranger, the fasts longer, the prayers more desperate. And no, one noticed when the theology changed just slightly, just enough to shift the blame from God to the self, because when the promised land failed to thrive, it was not the vision that faltered. It was the people who had not believed hard enough, not suffered deep enough, not given fully. And the punishment was not wrath from above, but the withdrawal of purpose. And that was worse, because it meant they had failed the design, they had broken the covenant. And if they were not careful, the promise would be taken from them and given to others. And that was the most dangerous idea of all, that they could be replaced. And so they offered more, they knelt longer, they stopped burying the dead with names, and began using numbers, because names brought memory, and memory brought doubt, and doubt was a crack in the foundation, and cracks led to collapse. And no one wanted that, because no one knew what waited outside the circle, only that it did not contain promise. And as long as they stayed within the theology, within the suffering, they were safe. And that safety, even in starvation, even in grief, was more comforting than truth, because the truth was they had been trapped not by chains, not by walls, but by belief. And no one escapes belief, not without breaking, not without bleeding, not without being buried in a place where the trees grow too quickly, and the roots drink deeply of the silence that once wore the face of God and now wears the face of Isaiah Westbrook, forever speaking, forever calculating, forever smiling beneath the church that stands where the dead were planted like seeds, waiting to bloom again, waiting to be counted again, waiting for the next family to arrive with hope in their hands and nothing left to lose. They arrived in silence, as if summoned by a code only they could hear. Two younger men, neither as tall nor as commanding as Isaiah, but with eyes that reflected the same glint of calculation beneath the veneer of piety. They introduced themselves as Daniel and Samuel Westbrook, brothers in name, but far more in function. One dressed in threadbare black with ink-stained fingers, and the other in rough leather with calloused hands and a permanent squint from years of measuring land beneath. A scorching sun, Daniel spoke seldom, and when he did, his words landed like pages torn from a hidden book deliberate, rehearsed never too many, never too few, his tone soft yet absolute, like a man accustomed to silence, because he only spoke when he had to, and Samuel did not speak much either, but he moved with purpose, measuring doors, adjusting hinges, repairing rafters, like a man who saw the world as one long series of things needing to be fixed, and beneath that quiet industry was the truth, one that no one suspected, because everyone assumed Isaiah stood alone, the radiant prophet, the divine voice, the chosen vessel, when, in truth, he was only the mouthpiece, the tip of the spear, and the work behind the curtain. The architecture of the promise belonged to the two who did not shout, who did not sermonize, who did not hold hands with grieving mothers, or offer blessings to fevered children, because that was not their role. Daniel, the scholar, had once studied at Yale, not long but long, enough to learn the language of the sacred, long enough to understand how Scripture could be shaped, bent, refined into something new, something usable. And when the debts came, when the lawsuits followed their father's failed business, and their names began to sour on the lips of creditors, it was Daniel who saw the escape, not through bankruptcy, not through exile, but through theology, because theology was exempt from taxation, exempt from scrutiny, and above all full of people too desperate to question. And Samuel, the youngest, had apprenticed as a carpenter, learning to build not just with wood, but with misdirection, how to craft compartments that vanished into the grain, how to make a room appear smaller than it was, how to hide things in plain sight. And when the family collapsed and the name Westbrook began to mean fraud and failure in the Northeast, he turned west with his brothers, not with regret, but with a plan, because unlike Isaiah, who still claimed visions and heard voices, Daniel and Samuel knew the truth that faith was useful when managed correctly, and that people would follow a man to their death if he could make their suffering feel holy. And so they worked quietly, Daniel writing sermons and theological justifications, copying from dead reformers, rewording obscure texts, stitching together doctrines that sounded old but were newly made, each one designed to tighten control, to justify loss, to turn doubt into sin. And Samuel, traveling from township to township, purchasing land that others had abandoned for good reason, floodplains, mosquito dens, shallow clay soil, and water so full of iron it stained the skin, and he bought them, not under his own name, but through proxies, farmers recently converted to the faith, given just enough coin to hold the deed, just long enough for the plan to unfold, and then pressured into surrendering the title when the fever came, or the crops failed, or the baby never woke, and all of it flowed back to the Westbrooks, who now owned more acreage than any other single family in the region. None of it fertile, none of it useful, unless you understood what they were doing, unless you knew that they did not need the land to grow crops. They needed it to grow control, and death was the fertilizer, because each grave, each abandoned homestead, each widow who fled in the night with nothing but her name was proof that the promise had been real, that the sacrifice had been made, and the land now cleansed, now ready to be redeemed. And they kept ledgers not just of names and tithes, but of temperatures, rainfall, outbreaks. They measured not faith but fever, tracked the cycle of disease against the calendar, and marked when to withdraw, when to reinvest, when to repopulate. And this was no accident. This was no reckless gamble. This was a machine, each gear, each wheel, each death part of a system that refined itself. With every iteration, and at its center stood three men, each playing his part: Isaiah the flame, Daniel the doctrine, Samuel the executioner. And what made it worse, what made it unforgivable, was that the people trusted them not blindly, but because they had nothing else to trust, because the cities had failed them, the banks had failed them, the old churches had failed them. And when Isaiah spoke, they saw light, and when Daniel read Scripture, they heard truth, and when Samuel arrived with lumber and nails, they believed he was building for their children, not for their graves. And by the time anyone began To question by the time a pattern could be seen, it was too late, because the questioners were gone, dead, exiled, insane. It didn't matter because the community closed around itself, like a wound pretending to heal, and anyone who left was erased from the story, and the rest were rewritten into saints. And when one settlement collapsed from disease, the Westbrooks mourned publicly. They wept in sermons and prayed in circles and sang until the trees swayed, but behind closed doors they studied. The yield they calculated losses and drew new maps, and each map was more detailed than the last, showing water tables, showing wind direction, showing where the sun would scorch the weak and the fever would find the lungs, and in the corners of those maps notations not of scripture but of value, projected returns per death, estimated land, resale prices after abandonment, all written in Daniel's small, careful script, all copied into the final ledgers that Samuel would later bury under the floorboards of the churches they built and abandoned. And Isaiah would never touch those books. He would never be seen near them, because his hands had to remain clean, because he was the voice, and the voice could not be corrupted, but the hands and the mind could be soaked in calculation, and no one would ever know. And yet something went wrong, not with the plan, not with the math, but with the land itself, because after a certain number of deaths, the ground began to resist, not literally, not with force, but with memory, the kind that lingers, the kind that makes animals avoid certain clearings, and makes children wake screaming in the night, with names they should not know and numbers they could not have heard. And Samuel began to notice tools going, missing boards splintering without pressure doors, refusing to stay closed no matter how many nails, and he stopped sleeping, not because he feared punishment, but because he feared that the land was remembering what they had done. And Daniel tried to write it away, tried to explain it in terms of collective guilt, of spiritual residue of trial by sacred memory, but his hands began to shake, and the pages began to fill with symbols that had no meaning, and Isaiah grew quieter, not in public, but alone, pacing, muttering, sometimes staring into the distance, as if something was looking back. And still the people came, still the faithful arrived, carrying their grief and their hunger and their useless deeds, and they were taken in and numbered and assigned plots, and each one thanked God for the opportunity to suffer. And that was the deepest horror of all, that even as the system began to buckle, even as the cracks appeared, even as the trees began to twist unnaturally, and the ground refused to dry, the faithful continued to arrive, continued to believe, continued to kneel. And it meant the Westbrooks could not stop, because belief once ignited does not burn out. It spreads, it consumes, it demands. And so they continued, because the alternative was to admit that none of it was holy, that it was only murder made sacred through repetition. And that would mean they had and monsters from the beginning, and not just architects of something terrible. And by then, that truth was too large to hold, and too dangerous to release, and so they built again, and the cycle began again, and the graves were dug again, and beneath each one lay not just a body, but a page, a note, a measurement, and above it all the cross still stood, and the sermon still rang, and the promise still echoed, even as it drowned in blood and silence and mud. It began with a dream. Isaiah told them, not a voice, this time not a scripture revealed in the folds of sleep, but a dream so vivid it left him shaking before dawn, his face pale, his beard wet from sweat, his eyes red and shining as though some unseen hand had peeled back the veil of heaven and showed him not eternity, but geography, a place not 30 miles from Milfield, nestled in the shallow curves of the Hocking River Valley, where mist hung like a curtain across the marshes, and the birds flew low and silent, and he called it the first true promised land, not a metaphor, not a parable, but a physical place consecrated not with oil or ash, but by the hand of God himself, who, according to Isaiah, had swept his fingers across the valley and declared, this is the ground from which the faithful shall rise, and the unworthy shall fall. And the Congregation wept as he spoke, because they believed, and perhaps they needed to, because by then the deaths in Milfield had already begun to. Trouble even the most devout not enough to leave, but enough to worry. And this dream came like a balm, a new start, a second chance, and within 2 weeks, 47 families had committed their lives to the venture, pooling their savings, selling their tools and livestock, giving everything not to the church, but to the vision. And Isaiah blessed each one by name, his voice trembling with holy fire as he assured them. Their journey would be hard, but redemptive, their suffering necessary, but sacred, and they followed him into the valley, walking behind his wagon like the chosen behind Moses. And when they arrived, they found nothing but mud and brambles and air so thick with insects. It seemed to pulse with its own breath, but they smiled. Because he smiled, and when he raised his hand and declared, "Here, here is where we build the temple of the second covenant," they fell to their knees and praised the God who had led them into this damp and silent Eden. They called it Eden because it helped them forget the waterlogged ground and the way the trees leaned toward them, as though listening, and the animals never strayed close, and the air hung heavy with rot even before the bodies. But they built because Isaiah told them to, and Samuel oversaw every beam, every nail, measuring spacing angles, calculating not beauty, not strength, but cost and mortality. And Daniel stayed behind in Milfield, penning sermons for the days to come, doctrines about holy trial through natural affliction, phrases like redemptive contagion and the sacredness of decay, words that would later serve as explanation. When the dying began and begin, it did not with thunder or plague, not with divine wrath, but with a cough, a fever, a boy named Thomas who went to sleep beneath a blanket of mosquitoes and never woke, and then his sister, and then a man who had worked waist-deep in the marsh for hours, trying to drain what could not be drained, and the ground would not dry, and the wells turned sour, and the hills. Children cried in their sleep for things they could not name, and Isaiah stood before them each morning, his eyes darker, now his voice slower, and he told them, "This is the path of the faithful, and every blister and every corpse is a stepping stone to paradise." And they nodded, they knelt, they prayed over the graves and dug more, and each one believed they were chosen not despite the deaths, but because of them. And they told themselves Eden had required pain too, that the original garden had been lost not by God's failure, but by man's weakness, and now they had a chance to be strong to do what Adam could not, to remain in the fire until it purified them. And Samuel kept his ledgers, writing with ink so dark it bled through the paper, recording each death, each plot, each asset returned to the church after the family passed or fled. And he never cried, not once, not even when whole families vanished. Overnight, not into the woods, but into silence, the kind of silence that sinks into the walls and makes the wind sound like screaming. And when Elizabeth Winters wrote in her diary that Samuel had the eyes of a man watching a fire he himself had set and found beautiful, no one read those words, not until years later, when the diary was found behind a rotted beam covered in mildew and teeth marks. And yet Isaiah returned to Milfield in early May, announcing that God had sent him another vision, this time for a second settlement, even holier, even more prepared. And he left the valley with Daniel and left Samuel in charge of the faithful, who by then had begun to bury their dead, not in rows, but in spirals around the meeting house. A design Isaiah had said would reflect the divine symmetry of heaven, but which now looked more like a whirlpool dragging life inward into the ground. And by June more than half the children were gone. By July, the elders began to collapse in the fields. By August, the air itself seemed heavy with despair, so thick the birds stopped flying over the camp, and the wind no longer came. And Elizabeth wrote of her own husband Ezekiel that he refused to let her leave, saying to abandon the promised land was to abandon their eternal souls, and that even if she took the children, they would be unprotected outside the covenant, and she did not argue, because by then she could not speak for the crying and the graves and the prayers that no longer sounded like hope, but like bargaining, and still Samuel walked the grounds, ledger in hand, boots coated in mud, fingers black with ink, marking down names and properties, and when he smiled, it was not with joy, but certainty, and when he sang, it was the same. Four-note hymn again, and again under his breath as he counted, and when the young last of the winter's children died, she wrote in her journal that she heard Samuel outside her cabin singing as he stood by the window, watching not with malice, not with pity, but with calculation. And when they finally fled the valley, those who could, those who still walked without coughing blood, they did so in silence, unable to look back, because behind them lay not just death but betrayal, and the fear that their faith had been used against them. And as they staggered into towns that no longer remembered them, they found cold stares and closed doors, and no one believed their stories, because Isaiah was still preaching, because his sermons were spreading, because he had already begun collecting for the next settlement. And when Samuel returned to Milfield weeks later, his ledgers full and his hands clean, he said nothing of the graves, nothing of the spirals, nothing of the red water rising from the wells, and Daniel recorded the Exodus as a divine purging, a necessary pruning of the flock. And Isaiah preached that those who remained had been found worthy and would receive their reward in the next promised land, which by then he claimed had already been revealed in another dream, and beneath the pulpit in Milfield, beneath the boards, carved by Samuel beneath the stain of so many feet, there was already another map, already another set of calculations drawn in blood and pinned to wood. And when the new families arrived smiling, hopeful, weary, they were greeted with open arms and hands ready to measure them for caskets not yet built, because the pattern was not broken, only perfected, and the promised land was not a place, it was a process, a machine, a system of belief so powerful it did not require fences or chains to trap you, only your willingness to suffer your need to belong. And once you gave that, you were already dead, already buried in a grave, not yet dug on land, not drained in a valley, already named, already marked, already sold to God and bought with your breath, your blood, your blind devotion. They said it came with the heat, that the fever was just the cost of summer, that the marsh always breathed death when the sun pressed down too hard. But Elizabeth Winters knew better. She wrote that the sickness moved, like thought, like punishment. It did not touch all at once. It chose, and each time it chose, it was closer to her children, and she began to notice things. No one else seemed to see how the mosquitoes came not in swarms, but in rhythms, how the dogs howled at trees that held no birds, and how the water in the barrels turned black at night and returned to clear by morning. She watched her neighbors die, not with chaos, but with grace, as though rehearsed, their bodies shrinking into the beds, like they had always been waiting for this. And the cemetery grew not like a place of rest, but like a mouth wide and growing hungry, and still the sermons continued, still the prayers lifted, still Samuel walked with his ledgers and measured the graves, not with grief, but with satisfaction. And when she buried Sarah, she saw him standing behind the trees, watching, head tilted, like a man trying to understand a painting and her husband. Ezekiel grew colder, not cruel, just vacant. He repeated Isaiah's sermon's word for word, even in sleep. And once she woke to find him digging behind their cabin, not for a well, not for food, just digging. And when she asked why, he whispered, "It's better if it's ready," and could not explain what it was, or who told him. And the fever took their son next, and then her sister's boy, and each time someone died, Samuel would appear, not to pray, not to comfort, but to count and record and whisper into the air, as if reminding the earth how many it had claimed, and how many more it owed. And the wind no longer blew, the sun no longer warmed, and the children no longer played. And the hymn they had sung that first day in the valley, now sounded like a curse, a thing pulled from the throat with effort and pain and the spirals of graves, now circled too close to the meeting house, and the meeting house now smelled of rot. Even when no one was inside, and the floors creaked when no one walked, and the pulpit cracked from the weight of Isaiah's words, even though he was no longer there. And one night Elizabeth went to the burial ground alone and stood among the graves, and waited for something she could not name, and she saw it not a ghost, not a vision, but a shape, a hole in the air, a place where sound disappeared, and it moved without moving it, breathed without lungs, and it looked at her not with eyes, but with memory, and she knew then that something had been made here, something beyond the Westbrooks, beyond the sermons, something ancient awakened by calculation, something called into being by the precise arrangement of belief and death and land. And now it wanted more. It did not want worship. It did not want sacrifice. It wanted to be understood. It wanted someone to continue the math. And she ran not back to the cabin, not back to her husband, but into the woods, and kept running until she no longer knew her own name. And in the morning the fever took Ezekiel, and Samuel wrote the date and the value of the land and the expected resale. And Isaiah preached of another vision, another promised land, even pure, even more worthy, and Daniel revised the doctrine to include the idea of holy subtraction, that God sometimes made room by taking the unnecessary away, and the faithful nodded, and those who doubted left, and those who stayed prayed louder, and the graves were moved deeper into the woods. And the meeting house was rebuilt, and beneath it a new compartment larger, stronger, sealed with iron and carved with symbols that did not come from the Bible, but from somewhere older. And the land watched, and the land remembered, and for decades the cycle repeated 15 settlements in all, each with its own spiral of graves, each with its own maps, each more refined, each more precise, until the Westbrooks no longer needed to preach, because the land itself called to the faithful, and they came with open hands and empty eyes, and gave everything, not knowing they would leave only names and ledgers and rotted cabins. And when the church in Milfield finally collapsed in 1847, and the workers found the journal, they thought they had uncovered a crime, when in truth they had touched the surface of a godless machine. And when Sheriff Blackwood died 3 days later, staring into nothing with his mouth frozen open, it was not heart failure, it was knowledge, the kind that breaks the body before the soul can scream. And his deputy fled, not because of fear, but because he understood, and understanding was the final curse. And the journal vanished, and the maps vanished, and the ledgers were never found, and the graves were never marked. But still the land waits marked with spirals, hidden under brush beneath towns with new names and parks, with no flowers and cemeteries, where the stones have no inscriptions, and somewhere the shape still moves, a hole in the world, a thought made flesh by belief and blood. And if you stand too long in the Hocking Valley, if you walk too deep into the trees, you might feel it, not see it, but feel it, something pressing against your ribs, something counting your breath, something remembering. And the land will whisper to you the way it whispered to Elizabeth, to Samuel, to Isaiah. And if you listen, you will know the truth, that the promised land was never a lie. It was a mirror, and it showed us exactly what we were willing to sacrifice to believe in. Something holy, even if it meant damning everything that made us human.